Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Vertical Space, a podcast at the intersection of technology and flight. We are your hosts, Jim Barry, Peter Shannon, and Luka Tomjanovic, and here we look at the most important forces shaping the market of advanced air mobility with a particular focus on why and how they matter to those building a business in this very exciting and growing industry.
The idea that safety improvements are written in blood, it's gone. Don't do that anymore. We don't do forensic safety anymore. We do predictive. We do data analysis. We see things starting to fray on the margins, and then we go after it.
Welcome back to The Vertical Space. This episode marks a first for our podcast. It's the first time that we recorded an episode in person, and we did it during the Honeywell Aerospace second annual Advanced Air Mobility Summit in Washington, D.C., where the three of us also shared insights on the industry in front of an impressive audience of government and industry leaders. One of the major themes of the summit was the upcoming FAA Reauthorization. And so in light of that, we sat down with Dan Elwell, who previously served as the Acting FAA Administrator and also its Deputy Administrator, to do a deep dive into the FAA Reauthorization and other important industry topics. We started the conversation with the pilot shortage problem, the structural and cultural forces at play, and how technology can help solve it. The discussion surfaces the currently somewhat controversial topic of the role that simulators play in the so-called 1,500-hour rule. Listen to why Dan believes pilots should be allowed to accumulate even the entirety of the 1,500 hours requirement in modern high-tech simulators. Most of our conversation, however, takes us back to the roots and foundational principles of regulating aviation, including an overview of the evolution of the FAA mandate since its founding in 1958. Although not novel, the balance between ensuring safety and promoting the growth of the industry is more important today than it ever was before, given how quickly technology is evolving. We hover on this topic quite a bit, and among other things, draw analogies to how commercial spaceflight is regulated. Listen to what Dan thinks is one of the most important issues that the FAA needs to figure out, and how what he calls the 737 MAX PTSD phenomenon and other factors create a chilling effect on the FAA workforce and their ability to be an effective regulator. As mentioned, prior to forming Elwell & Associates, Dan Elwell was Deputy Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration from June 2017 to November 2020. Before being appointed Deputy Administrator, Dan was a Senior Advisor to Department of Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao. During his tenure as Deputy Administrator, Dan served as Acting FAA Administrator from January 2018 until August 2019. Among Dan's previous career accomplishments, we highlight serving as Senior Vice President for Safety, Security, and Operations at Airlines for America, where he was responsible for leading the advancement of commercial aviation safety and security excellence for major U.S. air carriers, as well as Vice President of the Aerospace Industries Association, where he represented civil aerospace manufacturers and led policy development and advocacy for the civil aerospace manufacturing industry. More than 300 companies making engines, airframes, space vehicles, satellites, and unmanned aircraft systems. Dan was a commercial pilot for 16 years with American Airlines, flying DC-10, MD-80, and Boeing 757, 767 aircraft. While maintaining his proficiency as an MD-80 captain, he served as Managing Director for International and Government Affairs at American Airlines. Dan earned his pilot wings at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona after graduating from the U.S. Air Force Academy with a Bachelor of Science degree in International Affairs. Lieutenant Colonel Elwell retired from military service as a command pilot with more than 6,000 hours combined civilian and military flight time in the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Air Force Reserve, including combat service during Operation Desert Storm. Dan currently serves on several private and public boards, including Alaska Airlines Group. Many thanks, Dan, for a fantastic conversation. This episode of the Vertical Space podcast is brought to you by UAvionics. UAvionics is the leader in low-size, weight, and power certified avionics for manned, unmanned, and advanced air mobility aircraft. Let UAvionics help you achieve your goals, whether that be type certification, airspace access, or beyond visual line of sight operations. UAvionics has certified and certifiable communications, navigation, and surveillance avionics for your aircraft. So head over to uavionics.com or Google it to see how you can start flying safer and move your platform forward into shared airspace.
Dan, thanks for joining us on the Vertical Space. Great to see you again. This is actually the first podcast we've done in person. So, Dan, is there anything that very few in the industry agree with you on?
Well, thanks, Jim. And it's great to be on this podcast. We've known each other a long time, and it's a special, it's an honor. I'm at that age now where everybody agrees with me on everything, probably more to placate me than anything else. But 8 years ago, I penned an op-ed for Wall Street Journal, sort of screaming on the hilltops about a big-time pilot shortage. And at the time, I had just left a stint at Airlines for America, and I had started talking to my colleagues about what I saw to be a real serious looming pilot shortage is how the title of it ended up being. And I didn't have anybody that went along with me in A4A. So that was something that I, sort of tried to sound the alarm. And there was very few people that agreed, but to me, all of the pieces were there, and it was to me fairly obvious. And it's come to pass, and it's been helped by a couple of things that I never would have foreseen. But here we are.
Like what? What has not been foreseen?
COVID. Right. Mass early departures of pilots. Also, it was delayed, actually, the shortage by the economic crisis when they brought down capacity. And of course, there was the reason that they let all those pilots go and made all those great offers during COVID is they couldn't afford to continue to pay that many pilots over a period where there was no revenue. So it is what it is, and we have this pilot shortage. And
so how do you view the shortage right now, Dan, going forward? What situation are we in, and what are some solutions you'd recommend?
Well, thankfully, we're now in a situation where just about everybody except the Airline Pilots Association, ALPA, I think still holds on to their belief that there is no pilot shortage. There is definitely a pilot shortage. And it's plain to just about everyone, to the extent that now there are amendments being proposed and language being written in the FAA Reauthorization bill trying to address it. And, to me, despite all of the sort of dynamics that are created this shortage, there are clear ways, I think, to solve it. But I don't know of any short of Band-Aid fixes like increasing the retirement age of airline pilots to 67. I mean, that will help in the short term, but it's a Band-Aid. And so the real fundamental things that have to happen is, A, the pipeline has to be opened. Things like the 1,500-hour rule and others have sort of tightened the spigot to reduce supply of pilots. But the fundamental thing that has to happen is more young people of all stripes, denominations, and in all corners of our society. We need to get more young people involved in this great industry, and not just pilots. We need mechanics. We need engineers. You talk to any aerospace company today, they'll say workforce and the ability to get quality folks into their ranks is probably the number one issue.
So short of motivating the new workforce to join the ranks of pilots and maintainers, how can technology help alleviate the problem of pilot shortage?
Ultimately, you've got to get the same training done to be a safe operator, as safe as we currently operate aircraft, and better. It's got to get better. 95% of aircraft incidents today, and this was true when I was at the FAA, 90 to 95% involve pilot error. Anything that improves or reduces pilot error, but humans are humans. So the technology isn't going to necessarily draw more young people into the game and get more people involved. Although, and I'm going to digress here a little bit, somebody did a study not too long ago that showed that young people, we're talking that 18 to 26 or whatever, had more interest in racing drones and gaming when asked than getting into a cockpit and learning how to fly an airplane. So technology in a perverse way has sort of derailed young people from going to legacy stick and rudder type flying.
Why do you think that's so?
I think it's societal, it's cultural. I think it's probably cost and availability. I like to tell the story. I got turned on to flying in fifth or sixth grade. I can't remember because I had the same teacher for both years. And that teacher, he was a fifth and sixth grade elementary school teacher on Long Island, New York, said to his class, "Hey, any of y'all want to go up on a flight? I've got my Skymaster. Any Saturday, sign up. I'll take you up. Imagine today an elementary school teacher offering a flight in the Skymaster. I got on the right seat. He took off from an airport not far. Within minutes, we're 3,000 feet over my house. Never seen that before from the cockpit. And at that, what was I, 11?
You were hooked.
That was it. That was, that was all it took. So that kind of thing, there's just no way that that's going to happen today. So the initiative of getting them in simulators, I think, is the way to go to try to bring, and there's some new simulators being developed that are portable. You can put them in a gym of a high school and off to the races. It'll change them. And maybe that's how technology is going to do it. You make the technology affordable that then attracts folks into this industry.
Given that we're talking about sims and you mentioned the 1,500-hour rule, what are some thoughts on sim time and the 1,500-hour rule and some more innovative ways we may be able to approach it while keeping our safety standards?
So today, the regs say that as you reach 1,500 hours and the ratings that go along with that, no more than 100 hours of that time can be credited from a simulator, of any kind. I don't know the exact date that reg was promulgated, but I guarantee it was written at a time when simulators were not what they are today. There are things now that you can do in a full motion 6-axis high fidelity Cat D simulator you couldn't do 20, 30 years ago. And in my opinion, it's irresponsible to keep regs in place that limit how much of that excellent training. But think about it. Not only can you get in a simulator and practice things like explosive depressurization, rapid descent, recovery from a full stall, microburst escape, dial in a profile and refly an accident so you can learn what can be done. You can do that now in simulators with great fidelity, and not allowing more of that training, I think, is irresponsible. Also, the great thing, as we know about simulators, and it's getting even better, is you're going to have an instructor with you from beginning to end. You're going to not only be able, today, if you fly with your IP, if you fly up into your structure and round the pattern and land, the debrief is subject to memory and subjective thinking. Well, I didn't do that. Yes, you did. The sim doesn't lie. You pull up the tape. Here's what you did. You thought you did this, but this is what you did. And it's greatly edifying for a student to see exactly what they did wrong, or just as good, what they did right. And there's technology now that follows pilots' eye track. So the instructor can talk about scan, can talk about situational awareness. You can practice cockpit resource management. So I can go on and on. The argument today for the FAA bill that's blocking passage is how many hours of sim time you can allow towards that 1,500. I mean, to me, there should not be a limit. If you have the wherewithal and you have the ability and you can do all 1,500 hours in a sim, I say, why not? I'm not kidding. In that, they're that good.
So what are the counter arguments to this proposal in the debate that's taking place right now on the reauthorization?
So the counter arguments really surround one argument, that there is no substitute for time aloft, time in an aircraft. And I vehemently disagree with that. Much of the time for those who have to go to full 1,500 hours, and you know how the restricted ATP rules are written, the only people that go to full 1,500 hours didn't go to a 4-year or 2-year aviation accredited school, weren't in the military. So what is that 1,500 hours? It's time either burning up the pattern, towing a banner, or sitting in the right seat instructing somebody else in a single engine piston. I don't view that as quality time. And if you're doing it solo in particular, Randy Babbitt and I wrote a letter to the Hill about this. Randy was an instructor. He went the civil route. I went the military route. And he said the only thing that he did in his solo time in airplane was cement bad habits. So if you're up droning and you're getting your 1,500 hours mostly solo, what is that producing? We don't know. Maybe you're the next Chuck Yeager, but maybe you're somebody at the end of 1,500 hours probably shouldn't fly 1,501 hours. And the problem is there's so few people now coming through the pipeline, and the airlines are coming back to full strength. That's the criteria they've been told they have to use. That's what they're going to use.
Does the thinking on the 1,500 hours change once we introduce the advanced air mobility type vehicles?
There's actually a regulation about powered lift training and powered lift certification. I think that work. The powered lift training reg was written before there was ever a powered lift civil aircraft. They did it in anticipation of the Osprey, the V-22, becoming the civil version of that. And as we all remember, when the Osprey started flying, they really struggled and had some issues, both with teaching pilots the dynamics of the rotating props and flying it. It was a complex airplane to fly. And so that obviously concerned the FAA, and they were proactive, and they put in this very lengthy and complex training program without an aircraft. And so when there was not a civilian version of the Osprey that came to the FAA, they had this reg. So when fast forward, I don't know how many years, 15, 20, I don't know how old the Osprey is now, but when the modern eVTOL came before the FAA, there were some in the FAA said, now we've got a vertical lift aircraft we can apply this training to. Well, the design, which is now flight, and I'm thinking of Joby in particular, the Joby aircraft, completely fly-by-wire, single stick control for all regimes of flight. And the FAA sort of put a round peg in a square hole with this, and we're dealing with it now.
And another thing that comes to mind is if the problem with giving more simulation credit towards the 1,500-hour rule is in any way because of a lack of confidence in simulation being able to represent reality to an adequate degree. It's an interesting contrast how there seems to be a lot more comfort in using models and simulation for development of aircraft and design of aircraft, and pushing aircraft as close as possible through certification using digital engineering methods. Yet when it comes to getting the person ready for real-world operations, that somehow breaks down.
I agree. I mean, that's an excellent point. Somehow when you get talking about pilots get a little bit even more egocentric than they would normally be. And for whatever reason, I have my own opinion of why ALPA clings so tightly to and makes sacrosanct 1,500 hours. They make the argument that the only way you can become a good pilot is to fly airplanes off the ground. It's a good soundbite, but it flies in the face of modern day training and modern day devices. It does. I'm not going to get in an airplane. If I don't get in a simulator, I'm not getting in an airplane and fly around until I find a microburst and let's see how I do. I'm not going to get in an airplane and look for icing and say, okay, what does it feel like to have moderate icing on my wings? I mean, these are things that you should practice.
How does the military feel about simulation time, and what's the equivalent conversation in the DoD?
We did a summit on pilot training and STEM in general. And Heather Wilson, my 82 classmate and Secretary of the Air Force, she came and spoke, and she talked about how the Air Force had turned on its ear the whole concept of, MOA flying and sim flying and practicing. And she used, sort of the example that I would have used when I went through pilot training in the early 80s. You went in that rudimentary sim, maybe 2 rides to introduce a maneuver. And then you went up in the area, you took the T-37 or the T-38 and you went up in the sky and you did 5, 6, 7 sorties doing that thing you practiced. Now in the Air Force, they'll do 10 sorties in the sim with the maneuvers, and then they'll ice it in the air. They'll confirm it in the air with 2 sorties. And in using that process, Secretary Wilson told us that they took a 13-month pilot training program, and I think they've reduced it to at least 9, maybe less, much less expensive, much more quality as far as the instructor being able to monitor the student's performance in that sim before putting them up in the air. So it's a safer process. It's a more effective training process. And yet we can't seem to get ourselves to do it in the civilian world.
Dan, we're going to talk about the FAA Reauthorization bill in a minute, but there have been CEOs of the advanced air mobility companies that have said that the extensive use of their vehicles will help to address the 1,500-hour rule. What's the value that these vehicles are providing that'll help to get pilots to the 1,500s faster than they otherwise would?
So, Jim, I can't speak for all of the emerging eVTOL companies. As you know, I'm involved with Joby Aviation. And Joby's business plan, training plan, pilot plan is to train pilots to fly their vehicle, to get them, it's going to be a 135 operation. But they're going to commit to getting their pilots 500 hours before they fly revenue flights. And Joby is committed to pilot flown aircraft when they start out with 4 passengers. So those pilots, Joby believes, they'll have no problem either training them or recruiting them, because one of the things that I think the direct answer to your question that the eVTOL industry will bring is the promise of multiple circuits and home every night. So, for folks with young families like I had when I was going on, 8, 9, 10-day Air Force trips in the 141, or 3-4 day airline trips at American Airlines, the idea that I could get up and fly this amazing aircraft that can lift vertically and then fly on the wing, and do that, up and down to different locations on demand for a day, and then come home and sleep in my own bed with my family every night. I think that's terrific, and I think they're probably going to be successful.
Dan, let's talk a little bit about the FAA reauthorization. What are your thoughts?
Well, every FAA reauthorization, if you've seen one FAA reauthorization, you've seen one FAA reauthorization. This one is as unique as I've seen. The fact that we've got the House and the Senate, at least we're ready to mark their respective bills within days of each other and go potentially to the floor almost simultaneously is fairly remarkable. But what's really remarkable so far in this bill is that you've got an incredibly disciplined House Aviation Subcommittee. They voted their 800 and something page bill out of committee 63 to nothing. Now that's some bipartisan work right there. They got a lot of real meaty, good things in that bill. There's going to be, as we heard at the Honeywell AAM summit, there will be some controversial amendments that they're going to have to hammer out tomorrow when they do their bill. But they have a bill, and the Senate does not have a bill. The dynamics of this reauthorization were somewhat predictable. The House is Republican controlled, so that bill tends to be, and it's also being marshaled by 2 individuals on the House side who know a lot about aviation. Sam Graves, the chairman of T&I, being the first chairman of that committee, who has his ratings all the way up to ATP. He flies 4 or 5 different Warbird, vintage World War II Warbird aircraft. He knows what he's talking about, and he knows what he's doing. The Senate, on the other hand, are somewhat fractured. They have some controversies they got to deal with training, 1,500-hour rule. They're getting tied in knots over the DCA perimeter rule. So they're a bit disorganized over there in the Senate, and the House is ready to go. And how that plays out is going to be, if you like the legislative and political world as I do, it's going to be some high theater. And we harken back to 2018 FAA bill, where they put out a bill without formally conferencing the 2 bills, the House and Senate. Those in your audience who don't know how bills become law, the House will write its own bill, the Senate will write its bill, and then they're rarely identical. So then they will come together. Members of both chambers will literally walk into a room that is in the center of the Capitol. So they'll come from their respective sides of the Hill, and they will sit in a room where if you plumb the line down the Capitol would cut the room in half, and they will literally conference their bills, their 2 separate bills, and they will make them one. Then they'll go back to their respective chambers, vote on that identical bill, and once both pass it, it goes to the president. In 2018, the House and Senate had separate bills. The House took their bill like they did last week, and they put it on the floor, and they had a bill. The Senate, they never actually marked up their bill in committee, so they didn't put it on the Senate floor. So they did what's called an informal conference, which is exactly how it sounds. They didn't sit in that building in the middle of the Capitol. They hammered it out by phone, text, email, what have you, member to member, and came up with a bill that the Senate then put on the floor and the House put on the floor, and it became the bill. And at the end of the day, the informal conference wasn't so bad, except I was at FAA during that time. And it was a little bit painful because one thing that happens when the two chambers conference their bill is they're able to sit down and go, wow, we've asked the FAA to do a lot of studies, a lot of reports, a lot of things. And everybody says 6 months from passage. Well, we can't give them 200 things to do in 6 months from passage. So they will actually in conference spread them out over the life of the bill, which was 5 years. They never conferenced that part. So we had like 100 something assignments from Congress all due in the first year of the bill. So hopefully this year, it's another 5-year bill. The last 5-year bill was the first 5-year FAA bill since the 80s. And now we're looking at possibly 2 back-to-back 5-year bills. Hopefully, if they do it, they won't burden FAA with all their studies and reports marched out in the first half of the first year of the bill. But I also think, and I think it was pointed out by Chairman Garrett Graves, Aviation Subcommittee Chairman Garrett Graves, technology is moving so damn fast right now. A 5-year bill is almost too long to address how quickly things are changing.
How does the fact that reauthorization actually needs to happen every 5 years, how does that impact the way that the FAA operates? What would it look like without this recurring thing?
Well, we actually have an example of what that looks like. It looks like 23 extensions. And before the 2018 bill was the 2016 bill. It was signed in 2016, but it took them, I can't remember exactly, almost, I think, 2 years to get that bill in it. And when the bill was finally passed, it was only 2 years long. It took them 2 years to do it. They were, when I say 23 extensions, I mean the FAA's authority to exist. And that's why it's called a reauthorization. Like any executive branch agency or department, it needs congressional authority to exist. And in the law that gives them that authority is all of the tenets of how Congress wants the agency to operate. So every 3, 4, 5 years, especially an agency like the FAA that's constantly changing because aviation's changing, they very much need their oversight responsibility, the FAA's regulatory and oversight responsibility to be tweaked. So a reauthorization not only gives legal authority for the FAA to do what they do for civil aviation in this country, but the limited time length of that authority is good because it has an end and it has a point at which you can readdress or newly address things that FAA has not had to do before, like eVTOL, like drones, things that require a new way to look at things. The FAA bill that had 23 extensions, I can't remember, there was 1 or 2 items that one of them was the slots. They couldn't come to agreement. Chairman Micah, his only option, sometimes it was him calling the shots, sometimes it was others. All they could do is say, well, we're going to extend the authority, the current rules that the FAA is under. And they did that 23 times. The shortest extension they did, I think, was a week. The longest was 6 months, but they did 23 extensions. And all an extension means is, hey, FAA, we can't get our act together here in Congress. Keep doing what you've been doing.
So reflective of this point in time and the velocity of technology that you mentioned and that we certainly see as well from our perspective, what are the consensus points in this reauthorization that people view as key relative to that? And what are your thoughts on those?
Oh, that's a great question. I think what we'll hear, we are hearing, first and foremost, is in this era of new entrants, new technology, how do we keep the safety standard intact and constant improvement? We heard a comment today from an MIT-trained engineer. We know that this is new stuff. There's going to be incidents. There's going to be accidents. And that's the real challenge, is you can't have that mentality. The idea that safety improvements are written in blood, it's gone. Don't do that anymore. We don't do forensic safety anymore. We do predictive. We do data analysis. We see things starting to fray on the margins, and then we go after it. So there's a lot of real great thinking folks who come from out of aviation in this AAM world. A lot of them are from Silicon Valley. And what do you do in Silicon Valley, right? You fail fast so that you iterate to the sweet spot. in aviation, as we all know, you can't iterate to where you want to be with people or even with cargo or with pilots. You got to be good from the get-go. That's the challenge.
So what do you think about the modern intersection of technology and innovation and maintaining safety levels? And you've seen the arc throughout recent decades of the approaches to safety in the airspace system to date. And that has been in an airspace system that has been built around technologies out of the jet age and matured derivations of those. And it has been during a time when the United States has taken for granted the fact that it is a leader, if not the dominant leader in aerospace during that time. Now we look to a new future in aerospace with a much broader playing field. Many other countries have the industrial base to field these new technologies, and these technologies are being pioneered around the world. We are looking at a really interesting intersection of imperatives of maintaining U.S. competitiveness in aerospace, realizing the benefits of this innovation, and yet also conforming with modern expectations for safety in the airspace system and for how we predictively explore and implement that safety for new systems. So some people would say there are competing priorities here, but I wonder if there is a middle ground, if there's a resolution that actually achieves on both dimensions, and if you have observations in how we go about approaching this.
There's a lot in that question. And we actually can go look backwards a little bit for how we've done this in the past. Commercial space. We had a desire to foster commercial space activities in this country, and partially driven by a desire to be competitive and to lead the world in this area. But rockets blow up a lot at a dizzying rate compared to commercial aviation. And there was talk from the beginning that commercial space would put people eventually on these rockets. And so the solution was the FAA's solution, because it has an Office of Commercial Space. We will regulate launch and reentry. We won't regulate the vehicle, and we won't guarantee the safety of occupants. I think the reasoning early on was it was partially in partnership with NASA, and it was also such an infrequent event that the decision was made to allow this industry to learn and grow and indemnify the regulator by having everybody who climbs on these things sign a letter saying, we know this is dangerous. So I'm not in any way saying that that's the path for UAM or for AAM. I'm just saying that was in a nascent industry. That was one solution. It remains the solution too. There are those, I happen to be one of them who think it's time now with the frequency of commercial space launches. I think it's time that we demand a higher margin of safety for commercial space. And the other thing I'll point out is the imperative of being the leader. Now, with things like eVTOL and AAM, being the leader is setting the market, as I was talking earlier today. So if you're going to set the market, that means you've got to have operations. You've got to have regulations. And what happens if you push that too quickly is you get the value jet syndrome, where back in that time, the FAA had the imperative of both safety and promoting industry. And it was decided after the value jet that value jet grew too fast. And because it grew too fast, it lost sight of its safety imperative, had that crash. And they took away from the FAA the mandate of industry promotion.
So speaking of commercial space, what about the safety of the people on the ground when we watch these reusable rockets landing very close to people above populated areas, coming down supersonic to land back? Describe the risk appetite in this particular scenario and contrast that with a lack of appetite and comfort with flying drones under 55 pounds over populated areas.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And as I said, the FAA's role in commercial space is launch and recovery. And the FAA is responsible for safety of property and persons on the ground within commercial space, not for people in the vehicle or the vehicle itself, which sounds sort of counterintuitive or oxymoronic, actually. But that's why almost all space launch pads are near coasts, so that the launch is over open water. And if you remember the second Challenger that disintegrated because of the weak tile, that recovery was over sparse Texas landscape. And as it turned out, the debris field didn't touch anything. And that was by design. And then the Challenger, when it would finally come out of space and re-enter and go to either Florida or Texas or California, by the time it was on final approach, it'd be like any other aircraft. And that wasn't commercial space, right? That was NASA operations. FAA was responsible for clearing the airspace. I'm not sure under NASA operations if FAA was responsible with the Challenger launches, responsible for the safety of people and property. I'll have to look that up. That's a nuance. In commercial space, absolutely FAA is responsible for that. I don't know during NASA operations if we had that. I don't know if that answered your question, but it really thought-provoking. And I've battled with that a fair amount.
There was a Falcon Heavy launch from an Avro. In this particular launch profile, the twin boosters detached and they returned not to the drone ship, but to the launch pad area. And there were a lot of people watching the launch. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of cell phone video posted of absolutely spectacular views of the reentry of the rockets coming back to the shore, coming through the sound barrier, and executing that incredible landing that they do. And Luke and I were exchanging on this video and watching it and just remarking at how close the people were to the landing zone. And it really raises this question.
You know, Elon and the others, I think, saw the writing on the wall. If we can't control how our vehicles, well, first of all, if we can't reuse the vehicles, we'll never be able to make a business case for this. But if we can't control exactly to the meter where they land, we're never going to be, fully approved to do this. What they'd like to get to is file and fly, like airlines can do, I think, but pretty far off. But I would suggest this, since you were looking at video. I got to see a launch. We were VIPs and we were a mile and a half. So when you took your phone and you zoomed in and stuff, it looked like you're on top of it. The same. I don't know how close the people you were talking about actually were, but there is a perimeter in regulation for launch. And all you got to do is go to any sort of urban airport to see how close people can get to aircraft on landings, right? DC is a perfect example, Gravelly Point. You just sit right under there. So, and I think in that respect that there's probably more margin given for recovery and for rocket launches.
Dan, let's wrap up the FAA reauthorization, but let's say from the standpoint of advanced air mobility, drones, electric aircraft, eVTOLs, is there anything in the bill that people would be particularly excited about in those three communities? And are there any concerns they would have based on what you see from the bill?
I can't think of a specific provision, like specific to drones, specific to eVTOLs. What I like in the House bill, and Senate mirrors this to some extent, is an overall drive towards seeing these industries, these pieces of the AAM industry succeed with efficiency, obviously safely, but doing it. I always hesitate as an aviation safety guy to say quickly, because quickly connotes not thoroughly. But you can see Congress wants the FAA to succeed at this endeavor. They're giving it the resources it needs to get this done, both, financial, personnel, policy, and they're telling the FAA, we want to see the BVLOS rule done. We want to see that done. And I agree. I think to the extent that you can put pressure on the FAA, it should be, because they've done a ton of work on BVLOS. There's been a lot of exemptions given for BVLOS. It's time to decide if you've done the job, let it happen. And that's always been the thing with the AAM, is that FAA loves to deal in data. You can't certify to 10 to the minus 9 unless you've got millions and millions of data points to support it. We don't have, rapidly getting there, but we don't quite have the history in AAM to support that.
So, Dan, do you mind walking us through how the mandate of the FAA evolved over the years? And you mentioned the value jet moment where this mandate changed. So, what are your thoughts on it and the appropriate mandate going forward?
The original mandate, and I think this mandate evolved. I'm not sure it was in the 1958 Act that established the FAA. We all know FAA was established in large part in response to the collision over the Grand Canyon, and having the FAA to regulate the skies was the first mandate. That was the first reason for its existence. I think the secondary mandate of industry promotion evolved over time as safety became better. The jet age opened up a lot more commerce in aviation, and the rest of the world started waking up to the magic of flight. And so industry promotion, the ability to open up more markets, a company wanted to start, and this is under regulated air service. So the mandate of industry promotion made sense. Deregulation hits, low-cost carriers come into the picture, and now there's an explosion of airlines popping up and failing, and challenges to the old paradigm that existed under regulated, the CAB and regulated air commerce, which led sort of inexorably to the value jet example. And when the IG and the NTSB concluded that the reason for the crash was poorly loaded oxygen canister, inflated tire, and all the details of that accident, I think the decision to take FAA out of the promotion business was appropriate. I do think that revisiting that role is necessary today. The industry has matured so much. The possibility of an explosive growth in any one sort of dynamic in aviation, with the exception, of course, of AAM, it's less. It's a mature industry. It's much more global than it was even 20, certainly more than it was 56 years ago, but even more than it was 20 years, 30 years ago. So it matters that the FAA hold up its industry as a shining example. There are companies, when I was at FAA, that would come to me and say, we compete against a foreign avionics company for a project, an ATC project in a foreign country. Their country writes glowing letters about their product and how they use it in their own country, and it works great, lasts a long time. We go to the FAA and say, we'd like a letter like that so that we can compete for this contract in this country. And FAA says, can't do it. Not allowed to say that you do what you do very well. I think that there's no harm in bringing that back and allowing FAA to, it doesn't have to be promotion to Americans, but helping our industry show that it is the gold standard. I don't see anything wrong with that.
You mentioned earlier that doing something quickly connotes doing something unsafely. And it strikes me as reflective of a discomfort with the new, with anything that is not approved, certified. So is this a broadly shared view in the FAA? And is this something that needs to be addressed?
So you just hit on what I think is the number one issue that FAA needs to figure out. Early on, I called it the 737 MAX PTSD. The FAA has sort of entered this perfect storm of things that can affect your ability to be a good regulator. And it's the rank and file engineers who put their John Hancock on directives or 8100 orders, or the different things that give guidance to our industry. Those folks who had ultimate confidence in their expertise and ability, and when they put their John Hancock on something, they knew it was right. They knew it because of their experience. They knew it because it's what they're comfortable with. It's what they know. And I'm grossly oversimplifying, and I'm seeing it with clients. I'm seeing it with regularity. They don't have that confidence anymore. Almost across the board, the FAA is strangely reticent to lean into this new industry. They would be sitting up tall and thinking about what they're doing on a good day, right? But on the heels of what happened with the MAX. When I say what happened to the MAX, it's not just the accidents. It's the second guessing that almost everybody who touched that airplane has been getting from the media, from the Hill, and I'm sorry, but from a fair amount of crackpots. We have, and I think it's important, but we have in this country a healthy respect and protection of whistleblowers. The three of us here are former military, and every single person who spent any time in the military, especially operational aviation, any kind of military where lives are at stake. If you have a problem with how things are done, you go to your supervisor. And if he doesn't handle it, every service has a process for elevating. They don't have that in the civil world. Every whistleblower case that came to my attention when I was in the leadership position at the FAA, my initial and my civilian folks who worked for me were always like, my initial reaction was, did he go to a supervisor? What did it? Oh no, he went to the Hill. He went to reporters.
Why is that, Dan?
Because whistleblower protection is meant so that folks who have a problem with how things are done in any government entity should not fear reprisal. And now there's all facets to whistleblowing there and the whistleblower law. A lot of good meaning people do go to their supervisor and they find that after pointing something out that they think is wrong or criminal or bad, they suddenly don't have that job anymore. They're suddenly moved somewhere. Now that's reprisal and that's illegal and that is totally inappropriate. But we have a culture now where a whistleblower comes out of, in this case, out of the FAA and goes directly to a Wall Street Journal or to a senator's office or whatever. Suddenly that person's word is golden. Yes, they're protected, and I understand that. But to assume that a person coming out of a building and saying this, that, whatever, it's sort of like turns innocent until proven guilty on its ear. It's the agency is, and the people involved are immediately in a black light and under suspicion because the outside world doesn't do the necessary technical vetting. It's too technical. But what they just heard from this whistleblower is, wow, it's in an article before you've ever had a chance to deal with it. That has an amazing chilling effect on the workforce. And I said it was a perfect storm, and I'm sorry I'm dragging this out so long, but the final piece is you have in the FAA more acting leaders in different positions within the agency than I've ever seen in my career. And it's a product of a couple of things. There's a lot of very qualified and very good senior execs who left in the past couple of years for whatever reason. I'm not saying that there's a cause, but the problem is their ability to get the right person in the right job with any sort of speed is missing. They're not doing it. So there are a number of positions that either have an acting person in the role or somebody that's been put in the role who has no experience in that division. What does that do to the folks who you expect to sign the orders, who sign the documents, who put their name behind something? They're looking up and they're saying, I don't know who this person is who they just put in an acting. They don't have the confidence to make him the permanent head. So what am I? Is he going to have my back? Is that new leader know what I'm putting my John Hancock to? Is he going to? So it's a situation there right now that they're doing their best in spite of all these conditions, but it's has a paralyzing effect.
So considering the advances that we need to make in advanced air mobility and the place that the FAA is in certification and the like, and given the number of acting roles that are there, something has to give. So either nothing advances or we need to do something more about the workforce. I mean, what's the way out? Let's say you're the new incoming FAA administrator. What are some things that you would do to help change this?
So we heard earlier today, Garrett Graves, he put it quite well. He said there's three things. You need the capital, you need the financial backing, you need the innovation, and then you need the regulatory underpinnings and confidence in the regulator that you have the regulations and the standards to fund and innovate into. We don't have the third piece. We don't have the regulatory underpinnings. And here's the coffin's the corner you get yourself into when you talk in those terms, right? Because if in aviation you say, well, we need venture capitalists and we need the banks to come in and we need the innovators to come in. So hurry up, FAA. So the first thing you're going to get there is FAA starts promulgating some regs for the industry, gets it going, and then the money's coming in. Now you're just kowtowing to to industry and to business and to the almighty dollar. They should go hand in hand. The biggest problem to me is the FAA never was very good at keeping up with technical innovation. But in legacy aircraft, they would come around, a new clean sheet would come around every, 10 or 15 years by one of two, big airplane. Now you've got new designs coming at you like monthly. And so to move with speed on those kinds of vehicles in that kind of rate, okay, the market doesn't have patience. Well, I don't know the solution there. The FAA is asked to do a lot. They're asked to certify something that they personally don't necessarily understand. So they have to test and retest. And to get them to a confidence level to certify a vehicle that they just met yesterday, it's a conundrum. It really is. I don't have the solution.
Do you think that the current, let's say, publicly traded advanced air mobility firms have sufficiently considered these log jams in their predictions of when vehicles will be certified and go into production?
So the regulatory pace is certainly not what these companies thought when they envisioned when they started. But I got to tell you, I've been very impressed by the ingenuity and the entrepreneurial spirit some of these companies have demonstrated to stay alive. As we know, especially in aerospace, innovative and new technologies in aerospace often go to DoD first or to NASA, mature there, and then graduate and come into the civil sector. So that's exactly what some of these eVTOL companies are doing. They're getting Agility Prime contracts. They're making it work through other means. And from what I can tell, DoD is more than happy to try this stuff out and to use this stuff. And I think that they have some pretty good ideas and some pretty good applications, but they're making do. They're the real strong ones with, as I said, with the entrepreneurial ideas that are keeping them alive. I think that they're going to survive, but nobody's under the illusion that the 100 or so companies in this space are all going to be around 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
So speaking of the military, there are platforms out there that accumulated literally millions of hours in the last couple of decades with the global war on terror and just broadly military operations. And yet none of those platforms have been certified by the FAA in the sense that we understand, standard certification to be. What are your thoughts on that, and why is this so?
Before I came back to the FAA in 2017, I spent time at the Aerospace Industries Association, and we formed a sort of a drone, and we hadn't called it AAM then. It was 7-8 years ago. And I went to the FAA on behalf of this nascent civil drone industry and said, hey, what do we got to do to get some regs to get this going? And say, well, we need millions of data points so that we can know that they're safe. I said, well, you got millions of data points. They've been flying drones in the military for 15 years. And the answer surprised me. He said, they don't share that. I said, what do you mean they don't share it? Well, we went to the military and said, we'd like your failure rates. We'd like to know, what they look like. They wouldn't share that. So I understand that it's different now, especially since it's kind of flopped and the military's looking to the civil thinkers to bring them new products. And I hope it's changed. I hope that there's a way. I understand national security issues can be sometimes opaque, but I think it's important that we're able to share safety data, right? And hopefully they're doing that now. But in the early stages, quite frankly, I think that it wasn't collected by the military as safety data. It was mission data. And there's a difference.
Dan, just a couple more questions before we get to our closing questions. First of all, what's your take this summer with the delays and cancellations that are happening? Is this just, it is what it is, and this is what we've seen over the last 5 years, and it happens to be we had a few more thunderstorms on a Friday afternoon in New York, and people are paying more attention to it? Or is there a greater concern for whatever reason that we should be paying attention to? Again, if you were the incoming administrator, would it be something legitimately you should put a lot of attention into?
Yeah, the delays, I think, are probably a function of a number of things. We went basically from, in the height of COVID, to zero operations within 2 years, almost back to full operations, and now we're eclipsing pre-COVID operations. You think about how quickly that vacuum filled, and you're going to have a hangover from that. And I think part of that is just the rapidity with which we got back to ops. It was tough on the operators, airlines. I mean, you got crews and not just flight crews, but, mechanic crews, ground crews, suddenly going from, are we going to see an airplane on Wednesday? When are we going to see another operation, to suddenly nonstop? So I think that had something to do with it. There's definitely a personnel issue with the air traffic controllers at the FAA. They have a real problem in N90 in the New York TRACON and in Route Center, and they're working on that. That's always been a problem. It was a problem when I was there. It was a problem before I was there. They have a little bit of a controlling problem. It's more structural and geographic than personnel in Jacksonville. So there's these little pockets, and if you have a pocket problem, and then you have a pocket problem with an unusual weather system at the wrong time, I think it's possible that those periods of delays were just anomalous, and I don't think there's anything real structurally different. Now, the aging equipment issue, the DCA issue a week or so ago, they fried a comm panel because it's just old. They couldn't keep it cool on a hot day. So, and that worries me a little bit, because the FAA budget has stayed relatively stagnant in real terms over the past couple of decades. And it's baffling to me, but they have to bump up ops because they have contracts, employee contracts, and they got to keep people. So they pay people to try to keep them. But then in the meantime, F&E, facilities and equipment budget stays flat, and it's aging. So I think that's part of the delay issue.
And you spend most of your time outside of government, and you spent some time leading the FAA. Based on what you've learned, and you've been asked to go talk to, let's say, a leading advanced air mobility company, and they say, all right, what do we really need to know about the FAA to really get things done? I mean, you didn't grow up in government. You have a really good perspective where you would give some advice. What would be a couple of points of advice that you would give to somebody who has a really good idea that they want to move quickly to certification to production that most aren't thinking about today?
First thing I do in a new company is I search hard and high and low to find the best former FAA engineer / executive regulator, preferably from the AVS shop, which is the certification or standards, and get that person in-house right away. I would make sure that my engineers and my policy folks, if I have them in this new company, I would tell that company, know the regs better than the FAA, so that when you are ready to meet with the executives and to sit down and say, here's our product, here's what we plan to do. The FAA loves information. And like any organization, if you pressure them and you say, why aren't you doing this? And we need to do that, you're going to get pushback. It's natural. The FAA, as we've already talked about, they take their charge of protecting the flying public very, very seriously. They do. And they're a large, complex organization, and crossing the T's and dotting the I's means more to them than just about any other organization I can think of. So if you don't have your stuff together when you go and talk to them about your product and what you plan to do with it, and I would offer one more thing, and I do offer one more thing to clients, as I say, don't just walk in with, here's what we got, what do we need to do to certify? Because most of the stuff coming into the FAA today, they haven't seen before. So you're not going to get an answer. What you need to do is go in, as I say, know the regs, know your product, and say, hey, here's our product, and here's how we see our certification going. This is our design. This is how we're going to comply with the regs that we already know cold. FAA loves that.
Dan, what do you think about EASA's approach and their balancing of safety with opportunity, and their approval framework that is responsive of risk of the operation? And specifically, now I'm thinking about the drones.
Yeah, I just talked to somebody today who is the recipient of that thinking in his company in Europe. I like it, right? I was not aware that that's how they were going. Quite frankly, I don't focus on Europe right now, but I do believe it should be risk-based. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but a definite misstep by the FAA was to pull the Part 23 certification basis out from under the eVTOL industry when they were a good year into working under that basis. It was the right basis to have, and then they pulled it in, and they basically replaced it with a clean sheet. No cert basis. Create your own. Part 23 was redesigned to be a performance-based, risk-based certification tool. It should stay that way. I talked to the European guy who was saying that they were going to get incremental authority based on risk to fly over unpopulated areas, to go short distances, to do stuff over the Med, maybe. They're doing that with regulatory approval. We're doing that by exemption. And the exemption application for a single company to get approval to fly to one customer with a drone can take months. And when you're talking companies that want to deliver products to tens of thousands of customers, and they got to wait months for approval, I'm not kidding. Address by address with no end in sight, that's not the way to do it. I think EASA has something there. Now, I don't agree with some of the vehicle certification philosophies that EASA has versus ours, but that's for another day.
We all get obviously excited about advanced air mobility, but again, you're the incoming FAA administrator. You got 10 things that you want to make sure you accomplish in the next 2 years. Is advanced air mobility on the list?
Absolutely.
And
I guess it depends on what you mean by accomplished. Does it mean I'm having commercial passenger and cargo flights and under the urban air mobility banner? Yeah, I would. Now, I don't know if my term would be long enough.
As the FAA administrator, for you to, with everything that has to be done, is advanced air mobility that important? It's on your top 10 list?
It would be on mine.
Okay.
It would. Only because I think it's here to stay. And if it's here to stay, you need to give it the attention, because once it starts, it's going to be hard to stop it, right? Not that it's going to be self-generating like some animal, but it is new. It's novel. It's got a lot of excitement behind it. It's got a fair amount of money behind it. So yeah, I would have that in my top 10. And part of that is because now we're not done with safety. It would all be safety related and safety oriented. But as I said before, the airline industry is a pretty mature industry, and it is changing. We are refining and we are making it safer. We still have the safest, in my opinion, the safest aviation system on the planet.
Dan, over the next 5 to 10 years, where do you see the industry going, and where is it going in a way that most people wouldn't predict, you think?
In the next 5 to 10 years, AAM, I don't see widespread autonomous flight. I don't see that. That's not to say that there won't be some autonomous flight within the 10 years, but I think you will see within 5 years certified AAM aircraft and operations. I mean, some of these companies are being smart. They're getting their 135s in anticipation of eventually getting their certification. 10 years from now, I see the urban air mobility aspect of, some call it the last mile, but it's the last 25 miles, the last 50 miles. I see these agreements with airlines that some of the eVTOL companies are making. I see them happening. I see eVTOLs in particular advancing quicker in the military. I'm not going on a limb saying that, but that I do see that. But what I'm waiting for, and surprised I haven't seen yet, is the regulatory breakthrough for larger drone cargo delivery. If FAA can get through BVLOS and over people, and if the counter drone side of the industry can get to the point where it can assure detection of bad actors, especially around airports and sensitive facilities, I think within 5 to 10 years, you will see that side of the industry, the delivery side, the cargo side, be ubiquitous, both on the small, the 107 side of delivery, to the larger vehicles.
Dan, what advice would you give to somebody who wants to start a business in broadly aviation or advanced air mobility?
I have been so impressed, both while I was still at the FAA and since I've gotten out, with the characters. And I don't mean characters like funny character, goofy character. I mean the character of some of these folks who are launching these companies, how serious they are. I remember being the designated federal official for the first drone advisory committee meeting. And the mood around the table of all the members was very Silicon Valley. It was very, as I said earlier, let's fail fast and get on with it. We're gonna crash these things a lot, and then we're gonna learn from it. And they so quickly went from how they design software to the mindset of designing aircraft that it surprised me and encouraged me. I was recently in California touring facilities of the Joby Aviation Company and what Joe Ben Beavert has put together out there in Santa Cruz and Marina, California. Some of literally touring, the cabin up in the foothills where he and his first engineers sat around a fire. And we were literally getting that tour saying, and that's the fire pit where they sat around sometimes till 2 a.m. And I had this sort of, I even stupidly told people, they laughed at me. I said, I just had this vision, like standing there 50 years hence, some 21-year-old docent with a bunch of people going, and that's where they first came up with the idea of, the morphed prop or whatever, whatever it is. And here's where they decided that they were going to go. And then this is where the first test on this. I think that it is that revolutionary, not necessarily Joby or Joe Ben, but the industry and the folks that are getting into it, I think is that exciting. And I think that it matters today what we do. Congress, the bills they write, FAA, the regs they write, and more importantly, the aircraft these folks are building and the sweat equity they put into it. It matters, and it's going to be talked about in the arc of aviation. It's going to be talked about as a very, very special time.
Dan, that's great. This has been a terrific podcast. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
Isn't that enough?
Thanks, Dan, for joining us.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Vertical Space Podcast. Reach out if there are topics that you would like us to discuss, and goodbye until the next episode. Unless mentioned, this podcast is in no way endorsing or promoting any person and/or company mentioned, and all opinions within the podcast are solely that of the presenters. The Vertical Space makes no guarantees, warranty, or representation of any information given in this podcast. Any information given is for informational purposes and should be used at your own risk. This podcast is for general, educational, and entertainment purposes only.